and she's also associated with Capilano University. So welcome. We're very pleased to be hosting our webinar today on intimate partner violence, animal abuse, and shelter, the Canadian landscape. And this is one of a series of webinars and learning briefs being funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and partnered with the Alliance of Centres across Canada, who have been funding this for some time now. The overall focus is supporting the health of survivors of family violence and family law proceedings. But before starting ourselves, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that SFU is on the unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Coquitlam, Simiamu, and Katsi First Nations. So the format for today is to have our two presenters, Dr. Rochelle Stevenson and Dr. Amy Fitzgerald, speaking for about 40-50 minutes or so. And Dr. Fitzgerald will speak first, followed by Dr. Stevenson. Then we'll move into a question period, and questions will be held until after the presentations are finished. That they can be placed into the chat box as we go along, and we will then open it up after the presentations are finished. And the chat box will be monitored by Dr. Yursich. And just to let you know, the session will be recorded and live transcripts taken. So now I'll introduce each presenter, starting with Dr. Amy Fitzgerald. And I'm not going to give the whole bio for each, since that information has gone out previously, but to give you a shortened version here. Dr. Fitzgerald is a full professor of criminology in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, and also holds a hybrid appointment with the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Windsor. Her research focuses on the intersection of harms, criminal and otherwise, perpetrated against people, non-human animals, and the environment. She's published several peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and books, and is currently working on 3 grant-funded projects. And second presenter, Dr. Rochelle Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson is an associate professor in the Department of Environment, Culture, and Society at Thompson Rivers University, co-chair of CSA's Animal and Society Research Cluster, and faculty member with the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group. At the core of Rochelle's research is the human-animal relationship. Her research has highlighted the importance of this connection in myriad spaces, and most of her work sits at the intersection of interpersonal violence and violence against animals. So I turn it now over to Dr. Amy Fitzgerald. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. All right, so Rochelle is just going to swap it out to share our slides. And maybe while we're doing that, I'll just say a few words about the research group that Rochelle and I are both a part of. And you see our lovely logo there, APARG, which is the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group at the University of Windsor, comprised of, let me see, there are 4 faculty members, and from diverse disciplinary backgrounds, including psychology, criminology, sociology and criminology, and women's and gender studies, and also a number of wonderful grad students. And we work together and focus our research on the connection between harms and violence perpetrated against animals and against people. And today we're here to talk to you about some of the research that we've been conducting over the past few years. And near the end of the presentation, Rochelle will say a few words about some of the ongoing projects that we're working on. But we're certainly happy to answer any questions that you have about any of these projects after we're done with the presentation. All right, next slide. All right. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the literature, we thought we would give you a brief overview of the work that's been done on the relationship between intimate partner violence and animal abuse. And the research has been conducted primarily in the US, and it started out in the 1990s, and it focused on domestic violence shelter samples. And the surveys that had been conducted with those samples found that between 25 and 86% of survivors who were surveyed reported that their partner, their abuser, also mistreated their animal companions. In addition to this co-occurrence, the literature also pointed to a connection between animal abuse and greater use of controlling behaviors, psychological aggression, and more varied and frequent forms of intimate partner violence. In addition, studies have pointed to animal maltreatment as one of the most significant predictors of femicide. So we decided in reviewing all of this literature that there were some gaps that we needed to focus research on. One of the major gaps was that we really didn't have data from Canada. So we didn't know what the co-occurrence would look like here in the Canadian context. Would it be similar? Would it be different in important ways? And is animal maltreatment connected to more severe and frequent forms of intimate partner violence? And in addition, we also decided that we needed to be a little more precise about the ways that we measure animal maltreatment, which I'll talk a bit more about very shortly. But before I do that, Rochelle, if you could switch to the next slide. We just wanted to give you an overview of the studies that we're going to be talking about today. And like I said, we're happy to discuss any of the other work that we've done or that we have ongoing. We're going to be talking about data from our surveys of clients and staff at 16 domestic violence shelters across Canada. And some of you on this webinar perhaps participated in that research or were kind enough to help us recruit from your shelter clients. So we greatly appreciate your assistance with helping us to gather this data. We're also going to talk about some work that we've done analyzing the general social survey data, and I'll talk about why that data is important and helps to kind of fill some gaps that existed in the literature. And finally, we'll talk about the census of domestic violence shelters that we did in Canada and the US in 2019. So right before the pandemic struck. Next slide. Okay, so one of the gaps that we noted in the literature, and it's I think illustrated by that wide range that you saw on an earlier slide, that the percentage of co-occurrence between animal maltreatment and intimate partner violence has ranged with shelter samples from somewhere in the 20% to up into 80%. And when we looked at the literature and reviewed it, we realized that it was different researchers were using different definitions of animal maltreatment. So part of the problem was making comparisons across studies, right? And part of another issue then is that we have this wide range of co-occurrence. And I think part of that reason, certainly there are differences in the samples that are used, different geographic locations, et cetera. But I think part of the issue was that researchers were using different definitions. So some researchers would ask about animal maltreatment, focus specifically on physical abuse, right? So asking questions like, did your abuser, did your partner physically harm your pets? Others would include threats, neglect. So we ended up, there was a variety of ways that animal maltreatment was being used in the literature. So we thought it would be helpful if we had a scale that could measure not only different forms of animal maltreatment, but also to be a consistent measure that could be used across studies. So we developed what we came to call the Partners Treatment of Animals scale, or the PTAS. And in our pilot study, when we surveyed clients in domestic violence shelters, we asked them 40 different questions about their abusers' treatment of their animal companions, and then assessed whether or not there were scales and subscales that could be discerned from the data. And what we found was that there are these different subscales here for the PTAS, and that's emotional abuse. And we've given you some examples here of different actions that fall into this category: threats to harm the animal, neglect, physical abuse, and severe physical abuse. And so you can see here that there's a continuum of different forms of animal maltreatment. And also we asked the individuals to report how frequently their abuser engaged in these activities. So this is how we assessed animal maltreatment, using our 40 questions and then distilling it down to 21 questions that then mapped onto these subscales. Next slide. So when we use this scale in our survey of domestic violence shelter clients, we ended up with a statistic of 89%. So 89% of those that we surveyed reported that their partner had also mistreated their companion animals. And we found, interestingly, that quite a large proportion of our sample had companion animals, approximately 60%. And unfortunately, as you can see here, the mistreatment of their pets by their abusers was quite common. So we're currently in the process of doing a much larger national scale survey of domestic violence shelter clients. And in addition, we're also surveying individuals who are accessing services from non-residential facilities and also members of the general public. So to use the PTAS and further assess its reliability and validity. Okay, in addition to the co-occurrence, the very high co-occurrence of 89% that you see here, we also found that animal maltreatment is a marker of IPV severity. So we found that individuals who reported more than 4 incidents of animal maltreatment that fell on the Partners Treatment of Animals scale are at greater risk of severe psychological, physical, and sexual intimate partner violence. So not only is there important co-occurrence here, but it's also, animal abuse is also, the term red flag is often used to refer to how animal abuse can be a warning sign of violence in the home. Now, this 89% statistic is important, and I thought it might be useful to put it into context. So last year, approximately 47,000 individuals received services from domestic violence shelters in Canada. And if we calculate, remember I said approximately 60% of our sample reported having companion animals, which is consistent with other studies of pet ownership in Canada. If we take that proportion and we apply it to the 47,000 people who have accessed services from domestic violence shelters, we get approximately 27,000 people with pets sought services from domestic violence shelters in Canada last year. Again, it's an estimate, but it helps to provide kind of a more useful, I think, conceptualization of what this 89% statistic actually means, right? And the fact that we have a large proportion of individuals seeking help from domestic violence shelters who have companion animals, and the vast majority of those companion animals have likely also been abused. And the impacts of that, not only on the animals, is significant, but also on the human victims. And I'll speak more to that shortly about what that means in terms of help-seeking behavior and what our research has found. Next slide. We also, as I mentioned earlier, conducted a survey of shelter staff in Canada. And one of the questions we asked was, are you aware of individuals in the community who you have been in contact with who have stated specifically that they will not come to the shelter because of their pets? And 75% of our participants, our shelter staff participants, reported that yes, they were aware of individuals in the community who had refused to go to shelter specifically for this reason. So this is a significant problem, right? When you have a statistic like this that points to a very large proportion of shelter staff, at least that participated in our survey, indicating that they know there are individuals in the community that are still at risk because they remained with their partner because they didn't know what to do with their pets. Because unfortunately, still today, although the situation is improving, which we'll talk about shortly, it's difficult to access services for companion animals at domestic violence shelters, unfortunately, especially in certain communities. So we've come a long way, but this statistic helps to illustrate the importance of developing programs to remove that barrier so that individuals aren't put in a situation where they refuse to access domestic violence shelter services because of their companion animals. Okay, next slide, Rochelle. Okay, so we also found through our domestic violence shelter sample and through our analysis of the general social survey data, which I'll talk to you about in the next slide, that individuals who report a co-occurrence of animal abuse and intimate partner violence are more likely to be female, to be younger than those who do not report this co-occurrence, to be living with a disability, and have a lower income. So this further helps to drive the point home that services through domestic violence shelters or in the community is really helpful, because individuals who fall into these categories, who have less resources, are more likely to need the services that domestic violence shelters are able to provide to them. Next slide. Okay, so remember I mentioned earlier that there were some limitations to the data that had been collected up until this point in time. And part of the problem, as I addressed earlier, was that there wasn't a consistent measure of animal maltreatment, which we've sought to redress with our partners' treatment of animal scale. But the vast majority of the research also relied on domestic violence shelter samples. And so, you know, there's a potential limitation there, certainly, and a critique that could be made, right? Like, is this relationship between animal abuse and intimate partner violence being overblown? Because all of this research has just focused on domestic violence shelter samples. So we sought to address that limitation and analyze the Canadian General Social Survey for the first time in 2014 included a question about animal maltreatment. Unfortunately, it was just one item. We had a list of 9. So hopefully we'll be able to, in the future, there will be more questions about animal maltreatment in the GSS. But to date, there's just that one. But the important aspect of this data is that it's a nationally representative sample of the general population, right? So it's individuals who are not in domestic violence shelters. It's individuals who are and are not in abusive relationships. And so with that question about animal abuse, we were able to assess, is there a relationship between animal abuse and intimate partner violence among the general population? And what we've found here is that, yes, there is a statistically significant difference. And this graph illustrates, we focused on physical, intimate partner violence, sexual, emotional, and financial. And we found that, yes, there is a statistically significant relationship there. And just to give you some, reference points for how these were measured, physical maltreatment includes things like threatened to hit, shoved, pushed, slapped, threatened with a weapon, beaten, choked. Sexual includes forced sexual activity or threats, sexual activity without consent. Emotional includes getting jealous, limiting contact with family and friends, threatens to harm others, tracking the victim or survivor. And financial includes things like preventing knowledge about family income, forcing to give up money or possessions, etc. So as you see here, there certainly is a large co-occurrence between animal abuse and intimate partner violence above and beyond what we see in domestic violence shelters. So I think what this means is that we really, it adds additional emphasis to the fact that we need to pay particular attention to how we're addressing victims and survivors of intimate partner violence, because we know the vast majority are going to have companion animals, and it's the relationship between animal maltreatment and intimate partner violence isn't just restricted to domestic violence shelters. There's likely a lot of people in the community, as illustrated here, who are experiencing these overlapping forms of violence and the repercussions thereof. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so as the graph illustrated, we found that among those with companion animals who reported no animal maltreatment, only 4% reported intimate partner violence perpetrated by their partner, whereas 50% who reported animal maltreatment also reported physical intimate partner violence. So where animal abuse is present, obviously it's important to attend to the safety and well-being of the animals being abused, but also the humans in that situation, because of this co-occurrence. And as I'll discuss shortly, it certainly has ramifications when it comes to help-seeking behavior. We statistically controlled for sociodemographic variables and found that there was a 16% increased probability of injury among those who reported animal abuse by their partner, and a 25% increased probability of fearing for one's life. So like the shelter samples, not only is there a co-occurrence of animal abuse and intimate partner violence among the general population, but we also see how animal abuse can be a predictor of more severe violence perpetrated against human victims. Next slide. We also found that this is the case with emotional abuse. So reporting animal abuse is associated with a 38% increased risk of reporting emotional abuse perpetrated by one's partner. There are also a couple other variables here that I wanted to draw your attention to that I think are important. So whereas threatening and harming animals is associated with a 38% increased chance of emotional abuse, it's only associated with a 7% increased risk of property abuse. And you might be wondering, why I bring that up? Why did we analyze this specifically? And we did this to see if there was an empirical basis for lumping animals with property. Because we know in the IPV literature for years, the practice has been to include animal abuse as a form of property abuse. And as we see here, animal abuse shares more in common with violence against people, right, than against violence against property. So it's important to take that into consideration. And in addition, because of many people, the vast majority of respondents in surveys, when you ask if they consider their companion animals family, they will respond in the affirmative that they do. Not property, right? So these relationships, even though legally animals are still considered property, we need to acknowledge that the meaning to the human victims and survivors is much different. They're not viewing them as a form of property. Next slide. Okay, so pictured here is an adaptation of the very familiar power and control wheel that was first developed by Pence and Paymar. And you can see here that this iteration of it has included animals and shows that the various ways that animals can be maltreated as part of the context of intimate partner violence. And it's important, and it's a useful illustration of the ways that animals can be used to exert power and control over human victims, right? Instrumentalized by abusers to harm the human victims. But as I mentioned earlier, even though abusers may be instrumentalizing them as tools, the human victims and survivors do not see them as tools necessarily, right? They see them as fellow victims oftentimes, and not as certainly not as property. So something that's important for us to take into account, because we want to make sure that we're not minimizing the relationships that individuals have with their companion animals or pathologizing those relationships, because for these individuals, they can be quite significant, especially for those who have been alienated from their other forms of social support. Sometimes companion animals are the only support IPV victims and survivors have left. Next slide. So as I was alluding to earlier, there are important consequences to the co-occurrence between animal abuse and intimate partner violence and the risk of severe IPV. When we asked our shelter sample if they had delayed leaving specifically because of their pets, 56% responded that they had, which is quite a staggering proportion, right? To think that proportion, this is the reason why they were delaying leaving. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, still having access to pet programs through domestic violence shelters is limited. So there is a large proportion who are unfortunately making this difficult decision about leaving and having to leave their companion animals behind. Additionally, when we asked those who did leave and have to leave their companion animals behind, if they were considering returning home because of their pet, a third of the respondents said that they were. So again, this points to the safety considerations. So even if individuals are able to get to the shelter, unfortunately, having the pets remaining behind can be leverage that an abuser can use to get the victim and survivor to come back to them. When we analyze the GSS data that I also referenced, we found that IPV survivors who report animal maltreatment are more likely not only to fear for their lives, but also to seek help from multiple sources of support than survivors who did not report animal maltreatment. So this is important because it illustrates that these individuals are probably searching for a variety of services, right? Reaching out to a variety of areas to try and access help. So these statistics are concerning for victims and survivors are not leaving because in some instances, because there's no safe place to go that also offers safety for their animal family members. So further risk. And I should mention that when we statistically controlled for length of the relationship and IPV severity, we found that those who were delaying leaving their abuser were the ones that were reporting more severe IPV. So again, it underlines the safety concerns here. And second, as I mentioned, individuals are putting themselves at risk then in returning to abusers because their pets are left behind. And as I mentioned earlier, we also, in the general population, are remaining with their abusive partner, are still with them to this day because they can't access services where they can take their companion animals with them. Okay, and now Rochelle is going to take over and talk more specifically about our census that we did of the domestic violence in the US and their programs.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So just kind of tying together everything that Amy just talked about is looking at some of those barriers to help seeking, right? And so there's a few key barriers that were coming out, not only of talking to our shelter staff, but also our survivors in shelter. And one of those kind of core ideas is really that lack of animal-friendly programs, whatever those might look like. And one of the things that I'll talk about in just a few minutes is what those look like across Canada. But really this idea that survivors are faced with having to leave very often what is a single form of support behind, often in a situation of risk. The other thing is that there's a consistent messaging that shelters are for women and children only, so those human survivors. And while that may be technically true, right, there's an idea of how do we prevent intimate partner violence or domestic violence writ large, and what we've just illustrated is that animals are part of that dynamic. Another study that we did, that our APARC colleagues did, was an analysis of shelter websites. And what they found was that less than 1% of shelter websites indicate that they offer on-site programs. And so there's an inconsistent or incomplete messaging around the inclusion of animals in intimate partner violence, not only in terms of what that includes, in terms of those definitions, but also that the presence of programs, and as we'll see, there are many more than 1%, the presence of programs are not being communicated to survivors. And we know that websites are one of those points of contact where survivors can go to seek information. And so not having this information on the websites creates an impression that there are no animal-friendly programs or that shelters are not welcoming. The other thing we found from our shelter data was that questions are not asked or are inconsistently asked on intake. So if there is a question, for example, on the intake form, sometimes it's asked, sometimes it's not, or there might not even be a question about, is there a pet in your life that you're concerned about their safety? And when there are pet programs in place, clients are not informed about them in a consistent way. So even when offsite programs, for example, programs that are connected with a community-based organization, there's a significant portion of survivors, so nearly half of survivors who responded to our sample were not informed about those programs. And an additional 25% were informed about the presence of safe pet programs, but only after they were in shelter. And so these are important or really kind of key barriers that we need to recognize, acknowledge, because if we can acknowledge them, we can then start making changes to address them. So in that light, we said, well, what's actually out there? Let's try and do a bigger project here. So we partnered with Red Rover, which is a nonprofit organization out of the United States, to figure out what was actually out there in terms of services. So we did a census. We compiled data, a list of every single domestic violence service provider in Canada and the US, including things like Puerto Rico and Guam. And we had a research team. I think at one point we had 21 research assistants working on this. And we reached out to every single service agency via telephone. And we asked about their services. We had a really structured interview that we went through. And so these service providers included folks like domestic violence shelters, transition houses, and other agencies that provided direct services to survivors. This was a lot of calls. And so what I'm going to present in the next kind of few minutes is the Canadian landscape. So Amy talked about intimate partner violence and animal mistreatment, and I'm talking about the shelter aspect of our presentation today. So this is just to give you an idea, and I think that we all kind of have an idea about the domestic violence service agencies in Canada. So we contacted 522 agencies in Canada with actually a really great response rate with 44%. And so the numbers pictured on the map here are the number of responding agencies from each province. So Alberta actually had the highest response rate with just over 71%. So 40 of the 56 shelters or agencies in the province responded, followed by Manitoba, where 14 of 22 agencies responded, representing about 64%. BC, where I'm located, we had almost half of our agencies responding to our request for participation in the research project. So 55 of the 111 agencies. Quebec was our lowest at just under 24% of agencies responding. So 23 of 97 possible agencies that could have participated. And we, just to kind of a methodological note, we did have a couple of French-speaking research assistants who handled are primarily French-speaking, so Quebec, parts of New Brunswick, which are primarily French-speaking, to really try and generate a cross-Canada sample. So overall, I think that what we do have is a really strong sample and a really good picture across the country of what's available. So one of the questions that we asked of our folks who answer the phone was, when you receive requests for information or services about pets, who are these requests typically coming from? And what we found was nearly 3/4% or 74% of calls for pet-related services or pet safety come from survivors themselves. And the remaining 26% came from concerned friends or family, other domestic violence services, and service professionals, for example, like lawyers or social workers. So what we know is that survivors are reaching out for help. One of the things that we have heard from some of our other works, right? So for example, our study with shelter clients and staff is that there's a general fear of being inundated or overwhelmed, for example, with requests for sheltering pets as a barrier to why they're not offering some form of safe pet program. Excuse me. But our study showed that the call volume was actually relatively low, with the majority of shelters in Canada reporting they fielded less than 5 calls per month for pet services. So while survivors are reaching out for help, it's not happening necessarily in the landslide that many shelters might fear if they're opening up the question about, are there animals in your life that you're concerned about their safety? And I think it's important to note that survivors are reaching out for help, though, and that the 60% or the 74% of calls for pet safety might represent, as we mentioned, the most serious cases of intimate partner violence, serious meaning the most severe, or the folks who are most in need of support from our agencies. So staff were also asked, right, recognizing that there was a little bit of kind of interesting kind of results that came out of our previous work. So staff were asked about how frequently they initiated a conversation when being called for service. And this is what we found. So the upside of this data, recognizing that this represents a substantial amount of services across Canada, is that 20% of services reported always asking about animals as part of their agency policy, their intake form, their intake conversations. And this is a really important win. The downside is that 38% of agencies never asked. And another 40% were intermittent about whether pets were a part of any initial conversations. And this is whether the case-by-case initiation happen on the part of staff, or the case-by-case initiation happen on the part of the client. And recognize, again, kind of going back to those barriers, that when any information doesn't mention animals or services for animals or possibility of services for animals, it's unlikely that the client will be bringing those up on their own. So what we do see is that there's a very large gap in policy, especially when combined with the fact that, again, very few service agencies mention animal companions on their websites or in their agency material. So there's, I think, a lot of room, and one of the things that we would advocate is a lot of room to grow here. So some of the reluctances around asking questions also came from, we don't want to start the conversation when we don't have services. And that's a fair concern. We argue that opening the conversation means that you can brainstorm those services. There might be amazing services or resources in either the agency kind of pocket or the survivor's life that might actually be able to be kind of brought upon. And as you know, folks who work in the front line know that there's a really informal network that happens in terms of supporting each other and each other's agencies. What we do see, though, is that the picture of safe pet programs across Canada is quite varied. And this makes sense given our varied geography, our varied population, and our varied needs. Some of our agencies offered multiple services, so they traded on more than one program, and that is reflected in the percentages reflected here. So on-site housing was offered for 21% of our shelters, and this is great. This includes where animals were living together in the shelter with their people, or perhaps on a kennel or in an outbuilding on shelter property. But the family, so the human and animal family, remained intact while they were seeking safety. And so that's a really important piece to recognize, is that, right, a full 20% of shelters across Canada are offering on-site housing, but yet only 1% are mentioning this on their website. So this is an important gap for us to recognize here. When it came to the on-site shelters, an additional 3% of the shelters, and so this represented only 6% of our sample, or 6 of our sample, stated that only approved service animals were allowed in line with legislative accessibility requirements. And again, this is an important recognition, especially when we think about the statistic that folks who experience intimate partner violence and animal abuse are more likely to have a disability. So they might be more likely to need, right, these accessibility requirements. 37% of agencies offered off-site options, and this could include an association with an animal shelter, for example, like the BCSPCA, veterinarians who might offer boarding, foster programs, either run through, right, a community agency or a rescue. Very often what we found was that off-site programs, so connection with a community agency, were paired with on-site or referral programs. So what we saw was agencies are using multiple programs to be able to provide safety for all family members who need a safe haven from violence. So 37%, so again, a 37% provided a referral to other services. And so again, animal shelter, vet, foster program, with an additional 3% stating that they would refer the client to another domestic violence shelter. And this is an important recognition of, like I mentioned, that informal networking between agencies. So in the case of a referral, the clients would make their own arrangements with the external agency for a safe home for their animal. So the domestic violence services that was initially contacted would provide basically the contact information and support the woman or the survivor in making those arrangements, but it was really on the survivor's side. The ad hoc, or the 11% of ad hoc folks, is where the agency did whatever they could in that particular moment to make sure that everyone was safe. And this included maybe things like suggesting family or friends, a staff member taking the animal home, or paying for boarding, and this kind of translated over into the other category as well. But the idea is that in the ad hoc category, they recognized that lack of safety for the animal was also a barrier for safety for the human survivor, and they did what they could in the situation. Importantly, and one of the things that we wanted to call your attention to specifically, is that a full 21% offered no services at all, with an additional 3% being unsure if the agency offered pet services. And so this means that there is 21% of shelters across Canada, 21% of communities, or 21% of clients and survivors who might not be able to access, right, a safe pet program for a needed member of their family who also needs safe haven. The 3% being unsure if the agency offered pet services is also concerning. While this is a relatively low number, this also says that there's not necessarily the best levels of communication happening at the agency level, which means that if the staff don't know if there's a pet program in place at the shelter, there's no way that they can advise the survivors when they call if there is any services for them to ensure safety for their animals as well. So when we're thinking about, again, kind of drawing off of those 21% of folks who don't have, right, a pet program, we largely, so one of the things we asked of our survey respondents or interview respondents in our census was, what are the perceived barriers to implementing a safe pet program? So why don't you offer a pet program? The primary barriers, and this mostly referred to on-site programs, was allergies. And this is a consistent top rated barrier. And so 38% of our sample mentioned allergies as a barrier. Safety, recognizing safety concerns for residents and animals, as 31% of our respondents mentioned this. And space, 30% of our respondents mentioned space as being a barrier. And again, I think that these are probably fairly reasonable barriers, but at the same time, there are a number of different agencies, 21% of our agencies, who have on-site pet programs that are operating successfully. The next kind of 3 top-rated barriers in our kind of census data was financial at 10%, so concerns about the financial burdens of accepting pets or having a pet program. Resident fear of animals, and this included both adult residents as well as child residents, and this was 8%. And then the concerns about animals being in communal space at 5%. So it really kind of drops quite drastically in terms of the perception of some of these additional barriers. We argue, and what we advocate for, is a clear need to address these barriers to implementing some sort of pet program, because doing so addresses the barriers to help seeking, which means that more family members can leave domestic violence and intimate partner violence safely. We also recognize that not all domestic violence shelters can welcome companion animals on site for a variety of different reasons. But there are many different models of programs that are available to meet the unique needs to each shelter and their clients. The beginning point to addressing some of the barriers, as well as the barriers for pet program implementation and the barriers for help seeking, is to ask those questions, is to ensure there's more consistency in asking questions about animals when clients call for service. This will help address not only an awareness of the need in any individual community, but also what kinds of services might be required or even available in that particular community. So after all of that, what are we doing now? Amy mentioned a little bit at the beginning. And so one of the things that we have done is we've received funding from SSHRC, an Insight grant, to expand our kind of pilot shelter study nationally. And so it's a much bigger sample than just the initial 16 shelters. We're looking for a very large cross-Canada survey or sample. And so we're going to be surveying shelter staff and clients, and specifically surveying using the partner treatment of animals scale, recognizing that this is an additional way to validate the PTAS, but also recognizing that it is a much more nuanced measure of animal mistreatment, as opposed to just simply, does your partner threaten your animal or has your partner harmed your animal? Right. Again, having all of those behaviors listed allows us to unpack the nuances among animal mistreatment and its connection to intimate partner violence in a more grounded way. We're also adding to this kind of expanded research, interviewing shelter staff and clients. One of the things we didn't do with our initial kind of survey was have that interview piece. And so that interview piece is really important to get that lived experience, to get that deep context around what's happening in those relationships, to better able to recommend policy, programs, support, and certainly, right, this research can be used by our domestic violence service agencies for funding. So the new additions in this particular piece is a concentrated focus on things like the efficacy of PEP programs. Are they working? Are they what our survivors need? And also those impacts on staff. So are they working for staff? What does that look like for staff? And as well, the impacts on other residents. So it's not just, for example, the folks who are guardians to companion animals that we want to talk to, but also the impacts on other residents. What does it mean to have an animal in the shelter when you're trying to seek support? We have also added comparison groups. So recognizing that some of the research, a lot of the research that we currently have is exclusively a shelter-based population. And so by adding, for example, our general community groups who may or may not have had intimate partner violence in their past, and support groups. So folks who might be experiencing intimate partner violence or have experienced IPV, but are still living in the community and seeking support on like an outreach almost basis. Maybe they're not in the residence or they're not in shelter, but they're still getting support from a domestic violence service agency. Recognizing that folks have different experiences with IPV, and that might represent a unique experience of IPV if they're not in shelter at that point. Or, as we mentioned, maybe a difference in resources or demographic status. But these are kind of things that we're still teasing out. We're still in the data collection phase. Some of folks might have received a request to participate in this research, and maybe this is a great opportunity to plug that if you are interested in participating, please reach out to Amy and I. We would love to talk to you because we are looking for a really wide variety and a comprehensive cross-section of our Canadian population when it comes to this. So just to wrap up, we wanted to kind of leave you with a few takeaways. So kind of these key ideas that we would really like you to hang on to as you leave the presentation, as you go back to your agencies or kind of the rest of your life. We want to really kind of put forth this idea that attention to animal abuse is not a zero-sum proposition. So spending time thinking about how you can support animals who are also victims of domestic violence in conjunction with how it is that you're supporting the sort of human survivors of domestic violence is an important intersection, and that it is something that actually serves agency mandates in terms of reducing some of those barriers to help seeking. Right? That animals are an ever increasingly important component of our society, right? As Amy mentioned at the beginning, right? The majority of folks, in fact, recent studies say 95% of folks will say that animals are members of their family. Right? And this is especially true for folks who are experiencing IPV. And we also argue that the research on and the criminal justice responses to cases of animal abuse do acknowledge the problem, but more than that, what we advocate for and what this research does illustrate is that a multi-sector response is necessary. That it's not just research, not alone, and it's not just the criminal justice system responses in terms of taking cases more seriously, but it's this multi-sector approach that is required in terms of not only addressing this intersection of IPV and animal mistreatment as an important problem we need to wrestle with, but recognizing that we all have a role to play in trying to address this, which at its root is really what we want, right? We want to stop this. And that recognizing, again, kind of in drawing on that, is that it's intersecting forms of oppression and victimization. So rather than, as Amy mentioned, thinking about animals merely as property, we want to encourage folks to think about animals as valued family members and as being able to receive victimization in their own right, as opposed to just simply a tool or something that's used to hurt the animal or the human survivor. That there is intersecting forms of oppression and victimization. And certainly some of the statistics that we presented earlier around the increase in severity and seriousness and frequency of intimate partner violence when animal abuse is also present brings that really home. So that is it for today for us, folks. We're more than happy to answer questions, and we really appreciate you contributing your time and attention to our presentation today.
Great. Thanks very much to each of you. This has been such an important topic to have discussed in this kind of forum. not only to inform practitioners working in shelters, but those in the wider community as well. For example, even legal practitioners, I think, working in family law, to become aware of this relationship, first of all, between domestic violence, ITD, and animal abuse, but also to become aware, as you both indicated, the needs that accompany addressing this kind of issue, the challenges and barriers that obviously also exist that need to be dealt with as well. So again, thanks very much. That's wonderful. And without further comment from me at this point, we'll now turn to questions to be asked from the attendees. And just a reminder that you can enter the questions in either the Q&A or the chat room. And so those will be forthcoming just in a moment. Thanks again, both of you, very much.
All right, so the first question we have from the audience for both of you is, how do we change the conversation about the value of non-human companion animals to IPV survivors with service providers? Their survival is intrinsically intertwined.
Could you repeat that question?
Sorry.
Absolutely. So the question is, how do we change the conversation about the value of non-human companion animals to intimate partner violence survivors, with service providers specifically? Their survival is intrinsically intertwined.
That's a great question. I hope you can hear me okay. I had to switch to my phone because my internet stopped working, of course. It's a great question. And I think one of the ways is to use the empirical research, like the research that we've been talking about, to demonstrate that these animals are so important to these people that they're even putting their lives at risk by delaying leaving their abuser, specifically because of their animals, right? Because I realize not everyone is an animal person, right? Fair enough. But I think recognizing that the data shows that for a number of people, they are critically important and they will put their own lives at risk in order to protect them. I don't know if Rochelle has anything to add to that.
I would absolutely jump in on that. I think that Amy is correct, and a really great suggestion using this evidence. And I think that our statistic around over half of women are delaying leaving. And I think it's important to note also that one of the things we didn't mention is that when survivors are saying they're delaying, it's not just a matter of hours, but we're talking like weeks, months, and sometimes even years. So it's important for us to recognize that this is keeping folks in situations of violence and harm for longer periods of time. And also recognizing that when 1/3 are contemplating returning to their abuser, we know that the highest period of lethality is immediately following separation. And so if they're returning, the likelihood of folks losing their lives, right, also increases. So I think there's some real life safety concerns that we could argue here. And then the other thing that I would suggest folks think about is around a bit more of a trauma-informed approach, right, which is really coming into our sector quite clearly, but that also includes meeting folks where they're at, right? And addressing those barriers means that they're recognizing the whole person, they're recognizing that whole relationship. And we wouldn't ask folks to leave their children behind. So why should we be asking folks or expecting folks to leave their animals behind when sometimes that relationship is just as strong? So I think it's a tricky conversation to have sometimes, especially when we're dealing with limited time, limited resources, limited space. But we really do see it as meeting the mandate of the service agencies in terms of providing support and safety for survivors.
Absolutely, thank you. And the same individual who asked that question did wonder if there are handouts or anything that they can share with service providers to help promote this work.
I think that we are working on compiling these into easy statistics. One of the things that we are doing is, if you look at our APARG website, which will be on the slides that will be circulated, is look to our website because all of our publications are there and easily accessible for folks as well.
Thank you. So now I'm gonna see if we can push a question to the screen, maybe. Oh, I'm not sure if it's showing up for everyone, but the next question is, when it is said that less than 1% of shelter websites do not talk about on-site programs, is this specific to animals or on-site programs in general?
This is specific to animals, right? Only 1% will even mention animals at all. Or sorry, animals in terms of on-site programs. Amy, did you want to jump in on that one?
No, that's accurate. It was just 1% on their websites that were indicating they had on-site programs available.
And
I
oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I believe if I remember correctly, it was, I believe 40% approximately of the websites that mentioned animals at all on their website.
And that was typically mentioned in the context of being included as part of the power and control element in that coercive control element of intimate partner violence. So, breaks your property, threatens your pets, kind of definition.
Yeah.
So for the shelters that did have a pet program, did they indicate how they addressed barriers like allergies, safety, etc.?
So I can jump in there, Amy. That's something that we didn't specifically ask in, for example, our partnership, like the work that we did in partnership with Red Rover, so our census of all the service agencies. But one of the things that we do know anecdotally from talking to a variety of different kind of shelters through our work is that there's tons of different ways that folks deal with that. So for example, just letting folks know that we have animals on site, we might have animals on site. Things like allergies, which is surprising that most of our shelters that we talk to say that allergies might seem to be a big concern, but once folks get in, it's not a big deal. Because generally speaking, the animals are not in common areas. There are rules kind of and policy around how the animals move through the shelter, right? They're not just running loose. There's increased cleaning protocols, certainly. And so the allergies are addressed in different ways. They go from just simply additional cleaning protocols to, in the case of one shelter, including a separate floor with a separate room and a separate air handling system and everything. So they can get quite elaborate or just quite simple. Safety, some of that is around rules and regulations, right? Some of that is around disagreement before you bring the animal into the shelter. This is how you're going to be expected to handle your animal. And those kinds of things. There are some shelters and certainly some homeless shelters or like crisis shelters that will say the animals are included, but whenever they're in, for example, dogs, whenever they're passing through common areas, they must have a muzzle on. And so there's a little bit of muzzle training that might be happening. It addresses not only things like safety concerns and fear, but also some of those liability concerns that folks might have in terms of insurance. So there's some really practical concerns around those as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that we're currently in the process of collecting data from our national study of shelter staff and clients. And we are asking questions in that survey, and then we're just beginning follow-up interviews to get more detail and nuance around, okay, what are the barriers? What are some shelters doing? Like, are there, kind of best practices that we can point to and say, okay, here's where there was a problem that was encountered, and here's how they addressed it, right? Because now one of the great things is now there are more pet programs in place than just a few years ago. There are a number of shelters that have done this. So other shelters don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? And so if your shelter is interested in developing programs, wants to know how to deal with some of these these potential problems, just let us know and we can provide you with resources, and we can even put you into contact with staff at shelters that have put programs in place so that you can ask them, if you have specific questions around the logistics of it. There are a lot of great people who have found these programs wonderful and want to help spread the word and help others with their programming.
Thank you so much. So the next question that has come up is, are no pet clauses in renting a barrier here too? I saw a recent bill introduced in Quebec seeking to ban no pet clauses in rental agreements. Should we be urging legislatures for more of these types of laws to help creating more options for people leaving IPV situations with animals?
Yeah,
Yes.
do you want me to jump in, Rochelle?
You can go ahead and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, it definitely is an issue, and it risks becoming a bottleneck, right? Because up to now, we've been using our research to really help to emphasize why we need pet programs in domestic violence shelters, recognizing that then we have more work to do, because if we're able to help solve that problem, then the next problem becomes, okay, what happens when they leave shelters? If they're going to be renting, how can they access housing where they can keep their companion animals with them, right? Because it's horrible to have them come that far and be able to keep their companion animals, then to have to make a decision about, being able to rent a place versus being able to keep their animal companions. And unfortunately, I believe the proposal that was mentioned earlier about Quebec, I believe that it has been turned down. So unfortunately, there's still a lot of work left to do in that respect.
So yes, I was going to mention that I think the Quebec proposal has failed. But I think that we can also look to different provinces. So for example, in Ontario, the landlord-tenant agreement they're not allowed to say no pets, right? So in Ontario, it's a little bit broader, right? So they can't ban pets. The same thing, they can't say no pets, no kids. In Ontario, that's great. In BC, it is perfectly legal for landlords to say no pets, and it is causing a bottleneck for many of our folks here. The benefit to, for example, what we see in BC is that BC Housing, right, which is our government agency supporting our domestic violence shelters and many of our supported housing and low-income housing, is shifted to encourage and advocate for pet-friendly buildings. And in fact, many of their new buildings are pet-friendly in terms of, short-term, long-term, and mid-term housing. And so we are seeing changes. It's just a matter of getting those changes in place and active so that it actually is making a difference for folks on the ground. So yes, changing the tenancy acts would be huge. And we can certainly see from examples like Ontario and BC how that can be done and done well.
Kind of following up on sort of maybe alternatives for this, a participant asked if there are any responsibilities that animal shelters have for providing safe shelter for pets in this kind of situation.
Yeah, often what we have found is that there are animal focused programs in jurisdictions that can fill short-term gaps, right? The problem is a lot of these shelters are already overwhelmed with animals, and so they're only able to keep the companion animals of victims and survivors for very short periods of time in crisis. So unfortunately, even though they do exist, they can be quite limited as far as time, and it's depending upon how much space they have available. I'll also add that in previous research I had conducted interviewing survivors, I asked them about their preferences for programs, and a number of them expressed displeasure with having their companion animal go to an animal shelter, because they felt that was going to be more stressful for the animal, and also they feared that the animal was going to be taken from them and put up for adoption to someone else. So unfortunately, it's for some victims and survivors, it's not going to be viewed as a viable alternative for them.
And I think just building on what Amy was saying, so for example, in BC, I know that the BC SPCA has their compassionate boarding program, which offers 2 weeks of boarding at a shelter and or foster care, depending on what's available, but it really depends on what's available. And many of our shelters are again, overwhelmed. And so if there's no space, there's no space. So it's a challenge. And in terms of the responsibility, I think the responsibility is to care for animals rather than caring for a specific subgroup of animals. And so I think that's where the challenge comes in.
A different question came in, wondering if you have any demographic breakdowns for your data, such as Indigenous women experiencing intimate partner violence.
That's a good question. Through the GSS data, unfortunately, because of the relatively small proportion of representation, we couldn't tease it apart. But we're hoping in the survey that we're currently conducting, our national survey, that we'll be able to have greater representation from different smaller groups, so that we're able to say, okay, if you're servicing certain types of communities, here are the potential issues that might be unique to some versus to others. And so we're hoping that data, having those survey responses, will allow us to address some of those gaps in the literature. Because to be honest, to date, there hasn't been much breakdown because of the relatively small numbers.
Another participant says, wonderful presentation, Amy and Rochelle. Thank you so much. Do you happen to know how on-site shelters are successful in their pet programs that allow their companion animals to come with them, considering the barriers that you've mentioned?
I'm not sure how we would measure success in that particular spot. But what we do see, so one measure of success is, for example, abandonment. So whether the survivor will leave the shelter and just leave their animal there, and that is incredibly low, like very, very low. And so that's a really important piece. One of the things that we have heard anecdotally, and again, this is something that we're investigating, right, with our current project, is some of those conflicts. What we do know is that sometimes they occur, but how deep are they? How intense are they? We're still kind of gathering some of those statistics, which is why it's important for us to have folks involved in the survey who do have on-site pet programs in terms of what that success looks like. And I think success is really just knowing that people are leaving abusive relationships when they need to, and that barrier has been reduced for that particular person, which is an important barrier.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that one thing I've noticed is that for the programs that really take off and do well, the individual, it tends to be, one or a few individuals who are spearheading it. But they do a great job of reaching out to community partners. Because one thing that I've seen, which I think is wonderful, is that I guess because of the growing number of homes in Canada that have companion animals, people are increasingly starting to get it and see this as a problem. So getting pet supply companies to donate food has become rather easy. Getting veterinarians to volunteer to provide services if the animals are need vaccinations or any medical procedure, etc. I've seen the veterinary community really step up here as well. So I guess that would be my suggestion, is to reach out to the community partners, because you might be surprised at how people say, oh yeah, I recognize this as an issue and we want to help, just let us know how.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of kind of closely interconnected questions. So I'll ask one and then the next. The first is, can anyone discuss the need for more training to recognize companion animals for police when responding to domestic violence complaints?
I'm going to throw this to Amy. Oh, I was going to say,
Oh,
here,
okay.
she's going to put me on the spot. Yeah, so there is some work being going on in regards to, because Amy and I both also sit on the Canadian Violence Link Committee, which is kind of founded by Humane Canada. And so we do know that there is some training and some work being kind of developed and hopefully delivered specifically for frontline police officers to start to recognize not only signs of animal abuse, but also the interconnection. We do know that there's not necessarily police officers, but other folks. So as part of APARC, we submitted a brief to the Senate Standing Committee on Violence Against Women. And our recommendations were taken in that training on the violence link, right, or the interconnection between intimate partner violence and animal mistreatment is going to be included in training, or is recommended to be included in training for justice system actors, specifically judges and lawyers, in terms of understanding what that means for survivors and that information, that grounding in that knowledge when hearing cases. So there is more training coming. It's just a matter of getting it going and getting folks to pick up on it. And so getting buy-in from the agencies, which isn't necessarily a quick process, but it is a process that we are seeing movement in. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add on to that, because what Rochelle said is spot on. And I would just, kind of emphasize that I think it's, and of course, as a researcher, I'm biased and I'll admit that, but I think we need more training, and training is wonderful. We need it to be really grounded in the research, because there have been instances. So for instance, in one of the studies we did where we asked clients, IPV survivors and victims, about the motivation, what they thought motivated their partner's abuse of their pets, to understand, how is this part of power and control? And what was really interesting was that some of the results were actually counterintuitive. So they tended to conceptualize threats and neglect of companion animals as being intentional and perpetrated as part of their desire to manipulate and control them. But they were less likely to perceive physical animal abuse in that way, which is really interesting, right? We have a number of theories for why that's the case, and we're hoping that our current data collection will provide us with a large enough sample that we'll be able to tease that out further. But that's why it's important to have, research informed training, because some of the findings can be counterintuitive. So you want to make sure that individuals are receiving training that takes these nuances into consideration.
Absolutely. And the other sort of law enforcement related question, which is why I'm grouping these together, is do you have any thoughts on how to close the gap in terms of like multi-sector responses? So maybe law enforcement and social workers, when they respond to cases with the co-occurrence of domestic violence and animals.
So I can jump in to start there. Yeah, so cross-reporting is certainly one of those tools in our collective toolbox that would be very effective. So this is the idea that there would be a more formal arrangement or formal agreement between, for example, the police, child welfare agencies who might be doing home visits, and animal cruelty investigators who might be doing a visit in response to a complaint. And so recognizing the signs across those sectors of what that intersection of IPV or domestic violence broadly and animal mistreatment looks like, and then having the authority and the policy to be able to report to those other agencies. So that way we have more eyes on the situation, but also more opportunities to offer services when they're needed. There have been some informal, right? We don't know that that does happen informally, just through folks understanding and kind of knowing folks cross-sectorally. But in terms of establishing kind of that cross-sector approach, I think is a really important piece to responding to this in, right, a multi-sector way. Again, that is kind of on our list of things to do and suggest and research, but there are certainly organizations. I know that there has been a very successful program operating in Colorado for a number of years And I know that in Wellington County, for example, in Ontario, there was a cross-reporting initiative that was happening for a number of years, but I think it has fallen by the wayside. And again, I think that speaks again to what Amy was saying, which is like these project champions that are coming from within the organization as they move, and as new staff come in, as maybe training and these particular things falter off a little bit, it tends to lose impetus. So it's about keeping that concerted, honest forefront pressure.
Yeah, and I think, having the shelter data in the early research was helpful, but now that we have the GSS data, the representative sample of the Canadian population, it really goes to show that these, the large proportion of co-occurrence between these forms of maltreatment. And one thing that's interesting is it looks like, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes animal abuse is referred to as a red flag for intimate partner violence. But what the data indicated, at least provisionally, is that intimate partner violence is a better predictor of animal abuse. So it works both ways, right? So it's helpful to have, certainly helpful to have animal service agencies who can reach out to human service agencies and report problems. But the opposite is also going to be critical as well.
And in your research, have you seen any other co-occurrences, such as the example provided by the participants is child abuse? Have you seen links there?
That's a very good question. And in our pilot study, because our sample was relatively small, we didn't have a large enough subsample of individuals with children and with pets in order to tease that apart. But with our, given our sample size that we have to date for our current survey, our national survey, I'm comfortable saying that we will be able to tease apart some of those other co-occurrences there.
And we do know from other research that yes, there absolutely is co-occurrence between animal mistreatment and child abuse, and that very often, unfortunately, what we do know from other folks who do research, looking at specifically child mistreatment, is that animal abuse is instrumental, right, in the child's silence and kind of continued silence. So that's just not something that we have specifically, as Amy mentioned, either had the data to do at this point or had the specific focus at this point.
I know we're running closer to time, but I think we have time for one more question. So I know, Rochelle, that you spoke to trauma-informed practice. So I think this question is probably a very good way to wrap up. The question is, one of the barriers I've noticed when teaching trauma-informed practice to animal services agencies is the sense that many workers are running out of empathy for people because they see so many animals suffering. I think sharing the information with those agencies is key. And the participants wondering maybe if you know resources for that, or if you can suggest even other research that would aid in that.
So I might just do a bit of a plug for my own publication. So Celeste Morales, who was with the Vancouver Humane Society, and I did a publication on trauma-informed practice in animal services. And I think that really, right, that lack of empathy is a symptom of burnout and compassion fatigue, right? And so it's part of that, right, secondary traumatic stress that happens when we're working in this very emotion intense sector. And so one of the things that I would suggest is trying to think about this in more of a one welfare approach, which is recognizing that the well-being of the animals is very much connected with the well-being of the humans and the well-being of society and environment. And so if we start to recognize and acknowledge those interconnections, we realize that, right, the human might actually might not be in a really good space. And so the animal might not be in a good space because of that, or if the animal isn't in a good space, that might be impacting the human and vice versa. So thinking about how we can take that kind of broader approach, that umbrella approach, recognizing that the well-being is interconnected, might start, and hopefully our argument is in the paper that would start to kind of ease up on maybe some of the lack of empathy and start to build some empathy and compassion for all folks who may be experiencing a hard time, animal and human included. And I noticed Sarita just put in the chat that, yeah, so Sarita is the one who took over from Celeste when she moved on to a great new opportunity. So, yeah.
Okay, I think that was a very good question and response to end with. And we should close now. But our thanks as well to all the attendees and their questions. And of course, thanks to our two presenters, Dr. Fitzgerald and Dr. Stevenson, to the interpreters, Violaine Trini and Lamis Alwan, and to our Western University Zoom coordinator, Abdul Rahman, and last but not least, Dr. Sarah Yursich. But are there any closing comment that one of you would like to make, or both? Yeah, okay, please.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you for your attention, and please feel free to send us any questions that you have. Rochelle very kindly, I just noticed, put our email address for APARG in the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help.
And yeah, I echo that. Thank you very much for all of your questions. And certainly if your question was in the chat or in the panel and it wasn't answered, feel free to reach out to us. We're really happy to have those conversations. Our contact information will be in the slides that will be circulated, as well as a reference slide, which will have additional information if you are interested in delving into either A, our publications more, or B, other research around this connection. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye for now. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.